Okay, so welcome everyone. A quick note that we are recording and that the recording will be published on our YouTube channel, History at Newcastle. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, wherever you may be located, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and in particular to the Pamalong clan of the Wabagal people of the land on which the Callaghan campus resides. Our speaker today, Charlotte Greenhalgh, is a senior lecturer and history program convener at the University of Waikato. She was previously a DECRA postdoctoral fellow at Monash University. She's working on the history of pregnancy in Aotearoa since 1940 and on collaborative projects on risky hormones, that is the international history of hormonal pregnancy tests, and social surveys. Today's paper is based on Charlotte's co-authored book project with Dr. Branka Brogdan and Dr. Tatiana Buklias, entitled The Fetus and the Lamb, Clinical Trials and Reproductive Risks Since the 1960s. Charlotte, over to you.
Thank you. Does that look okay sharing my screen for everybody? Thank you so much.
It does.
Okay, so thank you so much for having me. We have this new sort of collaboration between Waikato and Newcastle that I think really fits history super well. I think there's lots of connections and including strong connections in the history of medicine. So this is a book that I'm co-authoring. So Tatiana Buklias is a historian of science and medicine at the University of Auckland. And Branka Bogdan is an oral historian. She has a forthcoming book on reproduction in socialist Yugoslavia. And we have been funded by the Liggins Institute for this research, primarily and including a postdoc position for Branka. So we're really thankful for that. So our book looks at the influential Auckland antenatal steroid trial, which began in 1969 and is still running today. And we investigate the history of this trial to explain how clinical trials became a dominant form of medical research and how trials involving pregnant women responded to new understandings of reproductive risks that were really developing very fast in the 1970s. We're deep in writing the manuscript. We're working with Johns Hopkins University, who are interested in publishing this in one of their series. We're at the stage of reworking our book proposal for them in 2 sample chapters. And as a result, it took me a long time to write an introduction because I have just a lot of thoughts. So I'm going to try this way of introducing the trial, which is to tell you 3 alternative stories about it. So one is a sort of heroic narrative, one is a potentially villainous narrative, and then one is sort of introducing the questions that we're actually hoping to ask, which of course is to tell neither a heroic nor a villainous story. Okay, so currently the dominant story about the Auckland Steroid Trial is heroic. Both in Aotearoa and internationally, obstetricians, paediatricians, and medical institutes celebrate the innovative work of Graham Liggins and Ross Howie. And so we, for example, were funded by the Liggins Institute, a leading institute in perinatal research named after the lead researcher for this project, partly because this research is seen as so important and so sort of gold standard. So in 1968, Liggins discovered that corticosteroids helped to develop the lungs of lambs ahead of preterm births. Liggins and Howie quickly organised a clinical trial involving women who arrived at Auckland's National Women's Hospital in premature labour. The trial results were transformative. Women who were given injections of corticosteroids during preterm labour rather than the placebo delivered babies who were less likely to suffer from respiratory distress syndrome and more likely to survive. Antenatal steroids are now standard, often life-saving practice during preterm births. Internationally, the Auckland Steroid Trial is a symbol of how clinical trials, reliable reporting, and data analyses save lives. In the late 20th century, scientists aimed to make clinical medicine more objective and evidence-based. The Cochrane Centre was established in 1992 to combine and analyse the results of trials that had been completed around the world. The centre's logo is a forest plot that shows their meta-analysis of antenatal steroid trials. The diamond that you can see at the bottom, so these are just two versions of how this has appeared on the logo. But in both, the diamond at the bottom is the summary of the Cochrane's meta-analysis of all studies up to 1981. And it closely matches the findings of beneficial effects in the Auckland trial that were first reported in 1972. So you can see that very top line. So there's 7 studies. The very top line is that 1972 Auckland study. It's to the left showing benefit rather than harm. The length is sort of reflects the certainty of the findings, and you can see it almost exactly matches that diamond of the ultimate meta-analysis. So the Auckland Steroid Trial provided conclusive evidence for the use of antenatal steroids far ahead of their widespread adoption around the globe during the 1990s. The collaboration adopted the image to emphasize the, quote, human cost of failures to register, synthesize, and apply the results of trials. And in this case, the human cost refers to, in part, the avoidable deaths of preterm babies. Australia and New Zealand, though, did rapidly adopt this, so it was doctors further afield that took a lot longer to be convinced. In Aotearoa, Liggins and Howie are celebrated for their achievements. Generations of New Zealand scientists credit collaborative practices at Auckland's National Women's Hospital for producing global innovations in perinatal medicine. Liggins, as people say, aimed to solve the most pressing issues in reproduction. Howie was personally motivated to save preterm babies because he was the only person who could operate the hospital's unsatisfactory respirators. Their collaborative decision to move very rapidly from animal studies in sheep to human studies was apparently common sense or a form of genius or serendipity. Liggins and Howie emphasized that they wanted to generate scientific evidence and were not interested in promoting the adoption of their method, so they thought that the results would speak for themselves. Historians of gender and medicine are likely to ask, is there an alternative, controversial version of the Auckland Steroid Trial's story? After all, Auckland's National Women's Hospital is infamous for unethical research by Herb Green that was revealed in the 1980s, first in this coverage in Metro by Sandra Coney and Phillida Bunkle, and then in the following inquiry, the Cartwright inquiry. And you can see a picture of Herb Green at the inquiry on the screen. Beginning in 1966, Green studied the, quote, natural progress of cervical carcinoma in situ by withholding treatment without telling patients. Liggins and Howie rapidly launched the Auckland Steroid Trial in December 1969, just ahead of new drug regulations and new requirements for clinical trials in Aotearoa that were introduced for the first time in 1970. Liggins and Howie studied the effect of corticosteroids using the synthetic hormone betamethasone immediately after the thalidomide and rubella disasters of the 1960s revealed the vulnerability of fetuses. And in the 1970s, in the early 1970s, just as their Liggins and Howie's results were coming out, researchers were particularly worried about the effects of synthetic hormones on development, especially after scientists discovered the delayed and intergenerational effects of the synthetic hormone DES, which affected the reproductive organs of babies, of baby girls, of women who had taken the hormone at particular stages in pregnancy, and put those babies and then women at greater risk of a rare form of vaginal cancer. So in the 1970s, around the world, pregnant women were being excluded from most clinical research, especially on drugs, and we sort of know about the gaps in evidence that we have as a result. Liggins and Howie's clinical hypotheses were ahead of their time, but their research ethics were not. Women provided verbal consent to participate in the Auckland Steroid Trial while they were in preterm labour, while they were worried about the survival of their babies, and quite often, up until 1972, while they were on an alcohol drip to delay their deliveries. Few remember giving consent. So our research engages these questions about pregnancy, pharmaceutical drugs, regulation, risk, and research ethics, but not to reveal a scandal. We argue that the story of the Auckland Steroid Trial was more complex than scientific brilliance plus Kiwi ingenuity, or vainglorious doctors taking irresponsible risks. The trial was launched and carried out amid high uncertainty over reproductive risks and rapidly changing expectations about ethics. How did scientists respond in this climate? And how did their decisions shape the trajectories of clinical trials and the treatment of pregnant women and babies? And we think the answers to these questions are really complex and really interesting, and involve just multiple groups of actors and contexts. And so this is the current organization of the book. So we're sort of spotlighting all of the different types of actors and stories that we can follow out from this trial. So starting with animal research, looking at women, and then specifically thinking about research with drugs, the kind of debates over data and evidence, the formation of a cohort study, and then memory formation about participating in research like this. The Auckland Steroid Trial provides unique windows onto this history because researchers made the original trial into a cohort study that continues today. The first follow-up studies in the mid-1970s were motivated by international concerns about the effects of antenatal steroids on childhood development. These tested the first 300-odd children who had participated in the trial and survived at 4 and 6 years old. The 30-year follow-up study looked at the health of the infant participants now in adulthood, and the current 50-year study analyzes the health data of original participants and their children. Research findings gradually dispelled clinicians' fears about damaging effects. At the same time, generations of scientists responded to new standards of ethics and forged fresh relationships with women and families. So women signed consent forms for the first time in the mid-1970s. It was not until the 2000s that researchers explained the original double-blind randomized controlled trial in all of its detail, and clarified that participants may have received the placebo rather than the experimental drug. Across these decades, women passed on their research participation to their children, who engaged with the studies in the womb, and then as very young children, and then as adults, and some of them as parents. What did they make of the research and its role in their lives? So we're kind of like, I feel like we go in a lot of directions when we talk about this trial, but today my questions for this talk are about women and families' participation in this clinical research and about the legacy of the trial in their lives. So this talk has 3 main sections. So first, I want to focus on women who were arriving at National Women's Hospital in premature labour and their simultaneous experiences of the preterm births of their babies and participating in clinical research. And this section shows how and why the conditions of preterm birth and the hospitalisation of infants really overrode women's awareness of the research at all. Second, I tracked researchers' shift of focus to the babies who received corticosteroids in the womb and were first retested at the ages of 4 and 6. These follow-up studies in the mid to late 1970s began to remake the researchers' relationships with women and families in the context of early parenthood and the development of children. Third, I consider transformations in research ethics by the early 2000s, as the follow-up research aimed to engage virtually all the adult surviving children who had participated in the research while in the womb. How did this stage of the research address mothers? How did their adult children respond? And how did the research practices intersect with families' private memories of the preterm births and the life stories of now grown children? So the National Women's Hospital was a post-war endeavour in Aotearoa. It first opened as an obstetrical and gynecological unit in a hospital wing that had been built by the US Army during the Second World War. The hospital was renamed the National Women's Hospital in 1955 due to the role that it was assigned nationally in research and in training in these areas. Its purpose-built hospital building opened in 1964, and it's located on the edge of a volcano, Mangoikeke, and a surrounding popular public park in the central Auckland suburb of Greenhalgh. And this is where I was born, also in 1983. So all of this that we're talking about, building the hospital and the research, happened during New Zealand's particularly long and pronounced baby boom, which lasted from 1943 until 1973. So alongside the research, hospital staff delivered 50,000 babies between 1946 and 1963. Auckland's population transformed during these decades as new groups of migrants settled in the city. Young single Māori men and women were enticed from rural communities to the city by job opportunities. Māori migration to Auckland peaked in the early 1960s, and the community numbered almost 34,000 in 1966. Māori were a minority group within the city, but were markedly young and clustered in the inner city as Pākehā families shifted to more distant suburbs. Plentiful jobs at the time and recruitment by the state, companies and families attracted Pacific migrants to New Zealand and especially to Auckland. Keen to bolster the workforce, governments issued 3-month work permits from 1964 and set immigrant quotas after 1967. As a result, communities of Pacific descent expanded to over 50,000 people by 1972. Today, Auckland has the largest Polynesian population in the world, but was and remains a racially segregated city. As Damon Salisa writes, Pacific neighbourhoods, institutions and suburbs formed, quote, a Pacific archipelago within the city. Post-war housing shortages and racial discrimination by landlords forced Pacific migrants into substandard accommodation in inner city suburbs that were considered slums. In the 1950s, Auckland's inner city suburbs, such as Freeman's Bay, Ponsonby and Parnell, were home to 1/3 of New Zealand's Pacifica people. By the 1960s, significant numbers of Pacific people had also settled in more distant southern suburbs, such as Aotearoa, where state housing was expanding. Pacific migration increased in the 1970s, and the size of inner city Pacifica communities peaked in 1976. However, increasing unemployment in the 1970s reversed official attitudes to Pacific migrants and workers who were targeted in racist immigration checks, such as early morning dawn raids of Pacific households in 1974 to 1976. So women were referred to National Women's Hospital for specialist care for themselves and for their babies. Many others selected National Women's from among Tāmaki maternity hospitals. And there are many wonderful oral history studies and collections of Pākehā, Māori and Pacifica women that focus on childbirth and describe women's decisions about where to birth. Women in all these groups described the post-war expectation that they would birth in a hospital, and that National Women's Hospital was a good choice for its expertise and its equipment. Māori women have reflected on the lack of understanding of Māori birthing practices at the time, both among staff and among young women and whānau. Often women had learned in later decades about birthing practices and reflected on that. They also commented on the comfort they were provided at National Women's by Māori nursing staff. The Auckland researchers did not record women's ethnicity during the initial trial. This information was first recorded in the follow-up studies when it roughly mapped onto Auckland's population. So of the 258 children who were assessed in the mid to late 1970s, 78% were European, 15% were Māori, and 6% were Pacifica. Our 13 oral history interviews that Branca has produced with Pākehā women and their adult children. And in addition to archived and published testimonies from other women, the trial data provides insights into the experiences of Māori and Pacifica families through research notes and questionnaires that were completed at homes and in children's schools in the mid to late 1970s. So some women described the draw card of the renowned doctors working at National Women's. The media was attentive to the series of medical breakthroughs achieved by National Women's doctors in the 1950s and 1960s. These included Bill Liley's advancements of the diagnosis and treatment of damage caused by RH incompatibilities, which were a serious problem at the time, including his development of techniques for the first fetal blood transfusions. Women read about these achievements in magazines and newspapers, and from the 1960s, they watched accounts of them in TV documentaries. In 1965, Anne Lawson gave birth to quintuplets at National Women's. The Lawson twins were the first surviving quintuplets born in Australia or New Zealand and the fifth in the world. Their births were reported and celebrated around the world, and these news stories reported Anne Lawson's fertility treatment, which had been leaked to the press. The twins had been conceived during a trial of gonadotrophins as an infertility treatment. The story showcased National Women's Hospital's neonatal facilities and the, quote, wonder drug that Anne Lawson had taken. Infertility clinics then used the twins to advertise their treatments, and increasing numbers of women began to ask for them. And the New Zealand government provided this family with accommodation and with nurses actually inside a former hospital, a small former hospital. And the family story took a tragic turn when Anne remarried an abusive partner who killed her when the twins were 16 years old. So high-profile doctors like Liggins chose to focus on the biggest problems in their fields. Doctors at National Women's formed research groups that encouraged collaboration across their specialties, such as obstetrics, pediatrics, and endocrinology. The dominant research methodology at the hospital was clinical cases or records of individual patient histories, with decisions about treatment determined by doctors. There was a hospital committee that discussed proposed projects, and Liggins raised the steroid trial there, quote, to let the staff know what was going on and to enlist their cooperation. There was no external or formal ethics requirements by the late 1960s. Preterm birth was a leading problem for obstetricians and pediatricians in the 1960s. Babies born very early rarely survived. One of the biggest problems for preterm babies was their underdeveloped lungs. Liggins chose to investigate the still unanswered question of what causes labour to begin and therefore what causes it to begin early. Liggins thought that corticosteroids might be involved, and that's how he ended up discovering their effects on the lungs of lambs who were born early. Ross Howie was personally invested in helping preterm babies because he was the only one at the hospital who could operate the ventilation machine, and he deeply regretted the deaths of babies when he happened to be unavailable or travelling. By 1969, then, Liggins and Howie urgently wanted to understand whether the antenatal administration of corticosteroids helped to mature the lungs of babies as it did in lambs. So between December 1969 and June 1974, 1,142 New Zealand women who gave birth before 37 weeks were injected either with the experimental corticosteroid treatment or a placebo equivalent. They gave birth to 1,218 infants, and 988 of the babies survived the first 4 weeks. The first results were published halfway through the trial in 1972. These recorded a reduction of early neonatal mortality from 15% to 3%, and the incidence of respiratory distress syndrome fell from 26% to 9%. Thanks to this publication and the authors' conference presentations, the trial had gained international fame even before its end, with researchers internationally starting attempts to replicate its findings and collect new data. And it's difficult for me to describe this initial phase of the research from women's perspectives because they barely remember it happening. Instead, women vividly describe experiencing premature labour and the preterm births of their babies. Women remembered little about agreeing to receive the injections. This was partly because until 1972, women were administered an ethanol drip to delay childbirth and to give their babies more time to develop their lungs before birth. As a result, participants felt, quote, high as a kite and quite drunk when they gave birth. Joanne commented that she may have been asked if she wanted to participate, but, quote, it would have gone in one ear and out the other under the circumstances. Another woman, Laura, agreed with her doctor to receive corticosteroids outside of the trial, And she remembered saying that, quote, anything would be better than this alcohol drip. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, premature births were significant and shocking events for clinicians, researchers, and parents alike. During this period, medical developments meant that progressively younger and smaller babies could survive. As a result, medics, researchers, and parents were all surprised by the appearances of preterm babies. Mothers described their babies in terms of appearance as lacking fullness and plumpness that older gestation babies have. Lucy said she was taken aback when she first saw her daughter, and that she thought there was something wrong with her, quote, because she had these enormous hands and feet. For the now adult Dakota, her diminutive size at birth triggered a warm recollection of a picture of her father holding her in his hand. Quote, he probably had average size hands for a man, and I was smaller than his hand. Everyone was aware of the uncertainty of these babies' survival and long-term health. Mothers focused first on the survival of their babies. And this aligned with the initial measurements of researchers who were primarily interested in whether babies developed the serious health condition of respiratory distress syndrome and whether they survived. Many families told us that their child was deprived of oxygen, that they contracted sometimes life-threatening infections, and that their basic physical functions were controlled or very closely monitored for weeks and months after birth. Several families were told that their child would likely not survive, or that they would have permanent and severe disabilities. A post-mortem was ordered for baby Cameron at his birth, indicating how unlikely physicians thought he was to survive. His mother, Emma, remembered that she and her family were given probabilities on a regular basis that she found quite distressing. At first, quote, he had a 1 in 4 chance of surviving, and then we had a 50-50 chance if he lasted for a further 4 days. And about 20% of the 1,218 babies died in this early neonatal period. So there were 108 neonatal deaths in the drug-exposed group and 122 deaths in the control group. And these families were not contacted again by medical researchers who feared causing them distress. And we have not produced interviews with any families whose babies died. To fill some of these gaps, we rely on oral history accounts by New Zealand women whose babies died at birth or while very young, and on the wonderful analysis of oral historian Susanna Thompson, who has interviewed Australian women about their memories of stillbirths. And this material suggests that the experiences of stillbirth and infant death likely overrode parents' awareness of the clinical research. Nursing staff were also overwhelmed by the sight of premature infants. Few nurses had experience with premature neonates, and especially so for the very early gestations. Nolene Wilkening, who worked as a neonatal nurse in the 1970s, recalled that in 1971, when she underwent neonatal nursing training, infants less than 28 weeks could not survive. She, quote, remembered being astonished that we had 26-week babies that were saved, and now we've got 25-week and 2 24-week babies that were saved and are progressing normally, intellectually and physically. Cameron, who is now almost 50, was nursed for 3 months by a postgraduate nursing student, and her thesis was a report on his case. In her thesis, she described that nursing him from 3.5 hours of age was significant for her because, quote, that early in my postgraduate course for neonatal nursing, he was quite the smallest baby I had ever seen or nursed. Babies' first few days varied considerably, but the narratives of mothers to surviving children tend to follow a linear progression that paints a picture of triumph over adversity as their infants grew. Hospital staff attended to medical milestones, including how babies handled feeding and the development of their breathing, lungs, hearing, and sight. Families noted this monitoring and its outcomes. Lucy gushed with pride, remembering her daughter finally being able to feed on her own. Quote, my husband and I went up to see her one day, and we went past a room where there was obviously an important nurse talking to all the other nurses, taking notes about all the different babies that were in. And we heard her say that baby Stephanie was feeding beautifully, and we were so proud. Joanne and her husband were told that Dakota was not alive after birth. After about 2 hours and a final check by nurses before being taken to the morgue, the baby was discovered to be alive with a very faint pulse. After a traumatizing entry into the world, Dakota started, quote, gripping fingers, which Liggins assured her mother was a good sign. Dakota lived in an incubator for 2 months until she was as big as a term newborn, at which point she was allowed to go home to her, quote, delighted family. Mothers then recalled that their children thrived and outpaced their siblings. In size, quote, she ended up being the biggest of my 3. In intellect, quote, she was the smart one in the family, and in personality as they became leaders. The most significant medical milestone was when babies reached the development of infants born at term. Such development typically landed for families when the hospital transferred their child first out of an incubator and later to parents at home. Cameron's family described experiencing a roller coaster of emotions during this time. They responded to shifting medical reports that Cameron had an underlying condition and would likely not survive, that he was putting on weight, and that he was not responding to treatment. The family recalled their feelings of panic when they arrived to visit and could not find Cameron in intensive care. This was rapidly followed by relief when they discovered that doctors had transferred him out of intensive care and judged him almost ready to go home. Most of the babies came home around their initial due date. The moment was significant for families and staff. Cameron's nurse described his discharge poetically. In the early afternoon on a warm, late spring day, Cameron finally went home with his excited, extremely grateful, but rather apprehensive parents. Looking bonny in his beautiful clothes, it was hard to remember that red, scrawny individual of 10.5 weeks previous. The moment ended a traumatic period for mothers who had combined hospital visits and caring for older children, who had expressed milks for feeds, and who had watched their newborn babies being cared for by other people and surrounded by medical equipment. Mothers noted the physical development because their babies had put on weight and finally, quote, looked more like a proper newborn. The Auckland Steroid Trial became a cohort study as new researchers checked the development of the infant participants across their lives. And these follow-up studies gradually dispelled clinicians' fears about the potential long-term developmental effects of babies receiving corticosteroids before birth. By the mid-1970s, Howie and Liggins secured funding from the World Health Organization to begin following the development of the first 300-odd children who had participated in the trial and survived. The research was designed to address the concerns about long-term effects by testing children at 4 and at 6 years old, including medical, educational, and psychological tests. The Auckland researchers now required written consent from parents for all stages of the research. However, they did not communicate the specifics of the research process, such as the random allocation of the women in labour to the treatment and control groups, or the purpose of double-blinding the study so that neither researchers nor families actually knew whether women had received the steroid. Instead, Ross Howie's letters addressed all mothers as if they had been given the beneficial steroid treatment. He wrote, "You may remember being in the National Women's Hospital between 1969 and 1972 at a time when it appeared that you might deliver a baby prematurely. I understand that you were given treatment to help your baby's chances of survival." Reflecting researchers' eagerness to test many children, Howie's letters cited the follow-up studies, WHO funding, and described the urgency of its research questions. For our results to be meaningful, we will need to see as nearly as possible 100% of the children whose mothers had the treatment. However, only around 250 of the families were convinced and agreed that their children would participate, which was the lower number than the researchers had hoped, and delayed the publication of their results. Correspondence in the mid to late 1970s was addressed to mothers. The follow-up tests at that time also provided opportunities for some of the infant participants to engage with the research for the first time. Lucy remembered her daughter's delight in the medical equipment and procedures, which contrasted with earlier visits to National Women's when her daughter was 6 weeks old and so small that she was, quote, like a little doll compared to other babies visiting the clinic. At 4 years old, Lucy's daughter, quote, loved participating in the tests, especially when she had, quote, a little peg on her nose, probably referring to the continuous positive airway pressure ventilator, and was put inside a machine that she called a spaceship, and which inspired some pictures that she drew when she got home. However, Lucy herself said she didn't get any feedback about the results of her daughter's tests. By the early 2000s, the 30-year follow-up study followed a rigorous ethics process within the university. Now, researchers' correspondence and information sheets clearly communicated technical details, such as the division of participants into treatment and control groups. After the study, participants were sent their medical data, including the option to discover whether they had been given the steroid or the placebo. In the mid-2000s, researchers and ethics committees worried about potential harms to mothers and children of hearing that they had been part of a study that was done so long ago. And they were right to feel concerned. Correspondence from medical authorities carried weight for recipients. One family was contacted in error about a child who had died after 36 hours. And they said that distressing memories started, quote, flooding back. Another mother, whose son consented to participating in the 30-year follow-up, complained on Paul Holmes' popular Daily Show that she had never consented to being a participant in the original trial, and that it was the first time she had heard of it. Hers was the loudest voice of discontent, but several more women expressed concern over recruitment and ethics when they were contacted at this stage. Once researchers had located them, the follow-up assessments were of adult children and not of mothers. Yet both correspondence with mothers in the early 2000s and our oral history interviews revealed women reclaiming the narrative of the Auckland Steroid Trial. In 2005, one mother critiqued researchers' exclusive focus on the health of her adult son. She underlined her, quote, frightening experience of preterm labour and 2 subsequent infections to underline her direct contributions to the research. This woman supported researchers' claims about the overall benefits of participating in the research, and she offered her, quote, beautiful, wonderful son as living proof. She also argued that she was owed ongoing information and the chance to take part in the research process, quote, just as I was part of the guinea pig process all those years ago. The woman also revealed that the research project remained the subject of conversations among women who had birthed preterm babies on the same hospital ward. She reported a friend's feelings of disappointment that her child had decided not to participate in the follow-up research. And families had more time and opportunities to reflect on the effects of participating in the clinical trial as their children grew into teenagers and adults. Adult children began to ask new questions about their births and their earliest years. The answers revealed connections between their contributions to medical research and their personal survival and successes. And researchers facilitated these family discussions when they wrote to mothers and to their children and reminded them about the research. Women directed these family stories. Quote, it's all pretty much been passed down from memory from my mum and my close relatives, recalled Cameron. Well, David remembered that from early on, quote, my mother was the one who was sort of educating me on the story of the trial, his birth, and his, quote, miraculous survival. Women's stories were told and retold by their children, often using the same language and inflections, highlighting certain aspects over others and shaping memories over time. For almost all the people who participated as infants, the trial in some way played a part in their identity formation. Some families talked about the trial openly at birthdays, family dinners, and on special occasions. Others spoke intimately with each other, and conversations were limited to mother and child. Some of the stories became family legends. Mothers called their children special miracles. Infants, now grown, claimed that the story of the trial was unique and was their, quote, origin story. Adult children said that they felt that being part of the trial made them somehow, quote, special, and that it defined their strong bond with their mothers. Some of the respondents remembered feeling special as children when they got extra attention stemming from the trial. Others felt pride knowing that they had in some small way helped someone else. Many were aware that it was their mothers who had made the brave call to participate in the trial. Dakota recorded feeling, quote, a sense of pride, even though it's my mother's choice, not mine. Knowing I was part of something that has made a difference to other babies and mothers and fathers' lives around the world. So that felt really a little bit special. Among our interviewees, Laura was the only one who knew from the outset that she had received the steroid. She was not part of the trial, but received the drug from her obstetrician, who had heard about its early results. This knowledge formed the central point of her miracle story of David's birth, whom she still calls her, quote, special little kid. Many families assumed that they had received the miracle drug because their babies survived and thrived. Dakota's mother, Joanne, remembered, quote, we were in awe of that steroid trial in general. We were just quite convinced that it saved her life or went a long way towards saving her life. After hearing these stories, Joanne likened receiving the drug to, quote, winning the lotto. It was, quote, just an absolute miracle. The family emphasized the significance of the drug and the trial, even before they confirmed that Joanne had received it. Cameron's mother, Emma, on the other hand, had not received the steroid, but had always assumed she did because Cameron survived and had no brain damage. The trial and the drug were part of the family's stories about Cameron's birth and their feelings about his development. Cameron said that, quote, Mum always told great stories about it being the steroid. That steroid drug was applauded a bit and brought up in conversations with my milestones and everything. The family was surprised to discover later that Emma had received the placebo. Some families did not talk frequently about the trial. Twins we spoke to did not know about the trial until they were in their 40s because none of the follow-up recruitment had reached them, and their mother had never spoken to them about their births. They determined that their ignorance of the trial was an extension of the secretive and shameful nature of discussing taboo topics at home. They did not know about the trial because their mother did not tell them anything to do with their bodies, sex, and sexuality or reproduction. Quote, it just wasn't talked about in the house. So, to conclude, the conditions of premature birth initially overrode the experience of participating in a clinical trial for pregnant women, mothers, and families. Following preterm births, family focused on the health and survival of their babies. These were also the primary concerns of the researchers, although families were hardly aware that researchers were monitoring their children in this way. Many women did not even remember agreeing to participate in the research project during labour. In contrast, families were acutely aware of monitoring treatments and reports by hospital staff, which reinforced their focus on health outcomes. The medically significant milestone of children reaching the development of a baby born at term overlapped with emotional and practical milestones for parents who saw their babies gain weight and finally leave hospital. Families' private storytelling increased during the years between the first follow-up study in the mid-1970s and the research of the 2000s. Mothers' memories of participation up to 1980 were hazy, likely due to their busy lives with young children. The later follow-up studies provided opportunities to reconnect with families and to explain more about the medical significance of participating in the study. Families engaged more closely with the Auckland Steroid Trial when their children survived, grew stronger, and began to discuss their earliest hours, days, and years. The cohort studies therefore intersected with families' private lives in ways that wove the steroid trial and its miracle drug into some family stories about preterm birth. Thank you.
Fascinating. Thank you for a really interesting paper. Can I invite questions from the floor?
I can jump in.
Yep, Kathy.
Thanks very much, Charlotte. I found that really fascinating, and kind of you've come to the end and you're summarising this question or point about women's participation. And I wonder if you can say more about, they weren't given consent forms to sign. What do you know was the nature of their interaction with the medical and nursing staff at the point where they were participating or not? And the reason I ask that is that I always remember my mother telling me that she was offered thalidomide, and she was very nervous about medications and drugs anyway, and she refused it. This was in the 1960s, and she's very grateful and relieved when she told us this, because, you know, we know what happened. So how much discussion did people have about their participation?
So women gave verbal consent. This was like the setup of the trial, and that was really standard at that time, the end of the 60s and the early 70s, and sort of aligned with, I think, with other medical models for interactions between doctors and patients. So the idea that, you know, doctors individually would assess and make decisions, and be responsible for basically overseeing the ethics of their own care, you know, mostly individually. National Women's did have shared conversations about projects, but there was nothing formal. So it was really sort of just engagement with peers and knowing what was going on. And I mean, the oral history interviews from women who participated in the trial and their accounts of birth are markedly similar to other oral histories that we have, and sort of testimonies and autobiographies that we have about giving birth in the 60s and the 70s in general. So National Women's was a large hospital. You know, it still has this model of antenatal care that really prioritizes the convenience of doctors over the conveniences of women. That can be really quite dehumanizing, and that does not involve a lot of explanation.
Yeah.
And that definitely comes through in how women then talk about, because they talk about the staff and the doctors a lot, just in terms of that they're giving birth and it's premature birth and what happens.
Yeah.
And they, I mean, that, you know, and then so Branka is an oral historian and works with the accounts that she has to really talk about how the way women told the story highlights how that they felt alone. They didn't feel consulted. They didn't feel that there was discussion and choice.
Yeah, right.
And then there's kind of overriding thing of being so worried about the baby and that this birth is not going as planned. And of course, that encourages you to say yes, to go along.
Yeah, right. So it's sort of couched within the framework of, if you're thinking about women's agency, it's more about institutional protocol and this is what we're going to do, and you'll be part of this. But yeah, very, very interesting.
Yeah. And so I think, you know, for us, it's sort of like interesting that then the way they talk about the trial now is mostly glowing. And so for us, it seems really significant that basically women's account of this research would be completely differently if the trial had stopped in 1974.
Yeah.
And it was really because they kept explaining. Researchers got to keep explaining in new formats over time and keep contacting families. And then there were opportunities for discussion. Right. You know, women brought in young children, for example.
Yeah.
That really ultimately changed women's assessment of the research. Most of them, not all of them. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Nancy.
Thank you so much. Really fascinating work. At the beginning, you said that you would talk about three narratives, or that there were three narratives, and I think I only picked up on two. So you talked about the dominant heroic narrative, and then I guess one that made it, you could tell the story, so it was terrible. But the third, I mean, what you spent most of the time talking about is something much more nuanced, and so that's your third narrative, is it? And so what is your and your team's overall view of this now, if you have to craft a sort of succinct judgment and narrative about it?
So you sort of mean like whether this was a good thing for women and participation? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, is that something you are not wanting to do in this project? Are you saying, look, the past isn't like that. You can't have a simple line through. I'd just be curious on your take on that.
I think it's interesting to us that the scientists and medics themselves talk about this as some kind of magic, that it just happened. So they don't have like a fully formed kind of explanation for how it was when clinical trials were unusual at this time, you know, when there were so many questions about safety and ethics, and like just relating to the particular type of drug that was being used, and to pregnancy, you know, and to development. You know, why was it that this clinical trial was done so quickly and in the end so effectively and in this problem-free form? And I guess sort of our answer to that is to like build up the layers of context around this, you know, what's happening around the drug research and hormones and all of these different ways at the time, including the contraceptive pill, as well as other forms of hormones. You know, what's the expertise that really has been existing in Auckland to do with animal research, and this close connection between investment in animal reproduction for agriculture and then for human medicine. And then how does sort of the evidence get debated after it comes out? Why do people beyond Australia and New Zealand really resist it and not find it convincing, and actually want to go back to saying, well, I have local experience, or I have personal experience with patients, and I'm going to make my decisions on that rather than the outcomes of this trial from this quite far-flung place. And so I don't know, I'm trying to write rewrite the book proposal and say, what is it that we're actually saying about clinical trials? And I am finding it really hard to write that. And I think that our way in is to build up all of this context and to really break down the idea that this was in some way an obvious step, but what was all the knowledge that was feeding in that allowed it to happen and allowed it to happen here. So I think of that third story as just these deep layers of context and trying to get to some arguments, you know, from what was going on around the researchers, you know, as well as their individual decisions. And then sort of, I mean, like, you know, as I was saying to Kathy, women and families, it means different things to them at different times too. So I don't have a simple answer.
And I don't want to dominate the time, but just the ethical issues around contacting people who didn't have a good experience of this, who lost their babies regardless of being involved with the trial, feels like there's a missing piece there where they
it's like that to me as well, and the
likely have a very different view. I mean, one assumes. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think you know, this oral history material is throughout the study, but is concentrated in this last chapter about legacies and family memories. And I think that's going to end up being a particular kind of legacy, you know, for a particular group. But that actually, as we tell the story of the research and forming the cohort over time between the 70s, you know, and now, that we can talk about, about different experiences, because it didn't go this way for everybody. Yeah, I completely agree.
Thank you.
Kathy, you wanted to jump in again, I think?
Yeah, I don't want to dominate. If somebody else has a question though, Sasha, if I'm clear to go, I'll jump in.
Go for it.
Thanks. Charlotte, what you were saying then about the fact that by going back and keeping on explaining the nature of these studies over time, maybe helps you answer that other question and discussion with Nancy, that in a way those layers, as you were saying yourself, they allow you to reflect what's changing in wider public sentiment about the nature of medicine, the nature of health interventions and ethics itself. I think that's really, you know, I think it's actually really powerful because, you know, iteratively there's this explanation. But also I was wondering about the hospital as a site for clinical research, because hospitals weren't always sites for clinical research in, you know, their earliest form. So is there something, and I noticed the letter of 2005 is directed to Jane Harding at Auckland, and so there's a relationship between the institutes for medical research, the university, the hospital. There's a really changing, deep way of capturing now what medical research looks like in biomedicine.
Yeah. So that's the National Women's Hospital was set up and funded in that way because that was identified as a lack. in New Zealand. And so the postgraduate School of Medicine of Obstetrics and Gynecology is based there, and you have this sort of like multiple function in the hospital. So, and then, and then generations of researchers. So, you know, you've got originally Liggins as an obstetrician and Howie as a pediatrician, but then the research is picked up by educational and psychological researchers in the mid-70s, and then Auckland becomes a real centre for studying developmental origins of health and disease, and then there's sort of new generations of researchers who pick it up in the 2000s and afterwards as well. And every time they pick it up, they sort of are writing to each other, especially with the original, like with Liggins and Howie, and they're asking them questions and clarifying things and in discussion. And you know, and some of the families who write to complain about processes get passed between some of these generations of researchers. So yeah, I think it is a really interesting way of thinking about you know, not like about how medical and research ethics are evolving, but specifically about how that affects women and affects families along the way.
Yeah, thank you.
So I might jump in and ask a question if I may. So I've done work looking at medical practitioners in the 20s and 30s, and one of the things they're constantly obsessed about is the dangers of fetal alcohol syndrome, and maybe that's specifically the part of the world I do work in. But I was astounded to hear, I had never heard of ethanol drips. I'm assuming that there's a risk here to the unborn child from an ethanol drip. Was this a concern? Was this a balancing act? Can you say something about that?
I don't think it was a concern. Yeah. They do switch to a new solution. It's more like aspirin, I think, in 1972. So I guess, yeah, so there are then better options. But the overriding concern is that the baby's lungs aren't going to work if they need 48 hours for the steroid to develop the lungs. And so that's like overriding concern. And I think actually a lot of concerns about development this time, you know, are focused on earlier in pregnancies. Although people worry about all of this. And this is like one of the things that doctors say about why they don't immediately start using antenatal steroids, is that they want to know whether it affects children's development. So did you say that's in the 20s and 30s?
Yeah, that's about the consumption of alcohol they don't call it fetal alcohol syndrome, but they worry about the consumption of alcohol in the 20s and 30s and the impact that has on infants. This is in Central Europe.
Wow.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it being Central Europe in the 20s and 30s, they're worried about the impact on the quality of the race in this kind of the contact, but at least they're aware of it. We have a question in the chat from Effie. I wonder if women who did not recall their consent for the trial were likely to be more insistent in this way. This may be impossible to know.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's an interesting question. Yeah, I don't know. We could see if we could connect some of those dots from the kind of different stages of the records. Yeah.
All righty. I think we've come to the end of our time. So please join me in thanking Charlotte for an absolutely fascinating paper. Just before everyone goes, a quick note that our next seminar paper, which is a recent addition to our schedule, will be on Thursday, the 12th of October from 4 to 5 p.m. and will be online only. And our presenter, Ilke Yilmaz, will be discussing her new book, Ottoman Passports, Security and Geographic Mobility, 1876 to 1908. We hope to see you there, and thank you very much for coming today, and I hope you have a great weekend.
Thank you.